everyone believes in something. You're not enough to say I believe in nothing and think you're clever. Everyone has a worldview. Everyone has a lens by which they look at the world. And you have got to provide a justification for that. You have got to show how that's rational and reasonable and intuitive. So what is atheism precisely? The reason I think this is an important subject to discuss is because it's really not quite clear, because in modern discourse, atheism is a lack of belief in God or gods. And yet at the same time, it's far from a void. It inherently catalyzes a variety of different viewpoints and philosophical worldviews. And so these result in beliefs sprouting from what is a non-belief, creates a sort of paradox as to what is it precisely? Is it skepticism or is it denial? And the reason that's important and I think you'll find that there's a mixed view within how people identify with it, but the reason that's important because that shapes how we have dialogue and how we debate. So if it's just skepticism, well then the burden of proof is really on the Christian just to prove, or the theist to prove whether there is a God. If it's denial, then both have the weight to argue which is more logical and which is more rational and why they think that. And so it shapes really how we have dialogue, and it stops it from being a one-sided debate where the pressure is put on the Christians and the religious and the theists to actually, now there's pressure on both sides. And so the way I like to start this is just to kind of step back and think, well, what does belief really mean? So the way I like to think about it is our awareness of the world is what we call, or what translates into knowledge. But belief stretches beyond the sort of the mere kind of touching of supposed facts. And so while knowledge is a recognition of reality, that doesn't necessarily tell us how to incorporate that knowledge into our lives and how we should use that knowledge to go about the way we live our lives and what we value and the decisions we make. So that's where I think belief comes in. Belief is the confidence, the acceptance of an idea or the supposed truth of something, or even an individual, to the extent that it influences what you, how you behave, your actions, your lifestyles. And so you could say that belief is far more personal than knowledge. Knowledge is to recognize something from afar and think, yep, that's it. And belief is to then grab that, incorporate that into your life and to take it somewhat personal. And so when we value the truth of something, the knowledge of something, when we esteem it, that's where belief comes in. That's the essence of belief. It's to esteem what we claim to understand. And it's that valuation which shapes our interests and our actions. And so I think the great way to do it is to give an analogy. So a lot of people will say that they believe in love. They have an idea of what love is based on the stories they've heard, based on the relationships they've seen, based on the books they've read, based on their family background and upbringing. So they have an idea of love. But they also believe in the power of love to bring fulfillment, to help them through difficulties and challenges, and to bring, perhaps even to bring some sort of fulfillment in life. And so it's their belief in love that shapes their values and the decisions they make. They might decide to take risks for love or to make sacrifices for it. They might decide to pursue a good relationship over a career. It all might impact how they go about their life because their belief in the power of love to shape life and to possibly bring fulfillment. And so it's not just a concept they hold, it's something they honestly believe in. They're taking it personally. They're taking it and incorporating it into their life. It's a guiding principle for them. And so that highlights the difference, I think, the distinction between knowledge and belief. Now, it's important to say that when I'm saying this, I'm assuming that your belief is based upon knowledge, and it should be. Knowledge should fuel belief. Knowledge should shape belief. Knowledge should guide belief. And so I'm assuming that's the case. The problem is when people have beliefs and they're not grounded or they're not flowing from knowledge. And I think we have this dichotomy set up where people view knowledge and belief as somehow opposing things. You believe in something or you have knowledge of something. And I don't think that's the case. I think the problem is when people believe in something without any knowledge to it, but your knowledge fuels into a belief. Another example you could give, if I say, if I'm going to drive a big truck over a bridge, I could first analyze the bridge, do some mathematics and do some tests and say, yep, I think the bridge is strong enough. But when I actually drive my truck over it, now I've proved to you that I believe in it. Like I'm honest, I'm willing to put myself on the line to show that I do believe the bridge is strong enough. And so bringing this back to the topic, is atheism a belief? Does it make any claims? Does it have any confidence in those claims? But more importantly, does it shape or does it impact what you value in life and how you go about your life and the morals you hold and the priorities you have? Does it shape the decisions you make and your lifestyle? And as you'll see, atheism, it has multiple related meanings depending on the context. And I think this is where some of the confusion comes in. So we'll start with, do you disagree with anything I said there, by the way, so far?
No, don't disagree. I just maybe question, push back a little bit, because there's a perspective called scientism, where this idea that science as the pursuit of finding out things about the world around us, this idea that it is possible of finding out anything and everything that's worth knowing. And I think sometimes it is necessary to believe things not based on what we can know, or at least there are limitations to what we can know through empirical observation. And Gödel's incompleteness theorem shows that every system of thought has at base a sense of belief that's not founded on knowledge. So I would say, what we believe must have components of knowledge. There must be reasons to believe what we believe, but also there are limitations to knowledge. And it's necessary to believe things we can't necessarily always 100% justify, just on a very mathematical and scientific basis, not even thinking about religion. But I really like that distinction between believing that something is so and believing in something. If knowledge is about information about the world that's also in our heads, our psychological response to that in trusting or approving of it is a value judgment when we believe in something. And that tends to be when we make it an identity marker. When we call ourselves an atheist or a theist or something, there's like a response from us to perceived knowledge about the world. Yeah, I really like that.
Just adding on what you said there, I can see what you're saying about actually sometimes belief, it hasn't got full knowledge. And to go back to that analogy where, people believe in the power of love. They have knowledge based on past experiences, based on seeing examples in their family and stories and society and so on, that love can help people overcome challenges and blah, 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 blah. However, that doesn't guarantee that they're going to find a loving relationship. So they might take risks for love and go out their way and prioritize finding it. But they have no guarantee, no firm knowledge, so to say, that they're going to find that relationship, that loving relationship. And so you're right. There's a grounding of knowledge there, but there's still an element of going into the unseen. And we all have to do that in every area. That's an hypothesis, right? You had an idea and you think, okay, I'm going to just, go creative with something, which I have a broader base of knowledge, but now I've got to refine that.
It's a fuzzy inference, you could say.
Yes, that's a better way to put it. Anyway, so moving on. So if we start with a psychological perspective, and you'll see why. So in psychology, which kind of deals with personal experiences and expressions, atheism is appropriately defined as the absence of belief in God or gods. And so anyone who's not a theist is essentially an atheist. And so the analogy you often get, and I don't think it's a fair analogy, it's often just used to take the mick, is that, well, atheists will say, well, let's say you tell me there's a flying spaghetti monster, going around Jupiter. I'm not saying there isn't a flying spaghetti monster going around Jupiter, because I haven't got concrete evidence to show that there isn't, but I highly doubt it, and I'm not convinced, and therefore I lack belief in the flying spaghetti monster going around Jupiter. Now, the reason I don't think that analogy is fair or appropriate when we're talking about God is because I think there's 101 reasons for believing that there is a God. And I do think it's intuitive, and I do think it's rational. And it's also far more active than a passive belief in a flying spaghetti monster. But more importantly, I think a fairer analogy, which would be a bit more open about it, is to say, well, let's say we're to walk into a grand cathedral. Well, it doesn't have to be a cathedral, just some grand architectural building, something with beautiful design and artwork in there. If we're to walk into this big building and I tell you that the beautiful features and the beautiful design was birthed from the mind of a celebrated architect who, lives locally or whatever. Yet despite the tradition of architects being the source of such structures, you're not convinced. Okay. Yes, minds have the ability. Yes, we have experience to show that minds have the ability to create complex and organized systems, often being the sources of such creations. But the actual architect is someone you've never met, and the original blueprint, you haven't seen it. And so, yes, the alternative option seems scant. But the fact is, there could be perhaps an alternative explanation, possibly other than human force, something other, which could be the source of such creation, which could be the source of such design without the aid of a mind. And so you're not denying that there is an architect. You're just saying you haven't had sufficient evidence to wholeheartedly assert that there was, in fact, such a human architect behind it. And so that's, I think, a more fitting analogy. And so the atheists, when confronted with the concept or the question of God's existence, will say that they haven't had sufficient empirical evidence to wholeheartedly say that there was indeed that there is actually such a God. That's not always the case. It's not always to do with the lack of evidence. So, and I know there's many atheists, after reading parts of the Old Testament, find, certain portrayals of God to be morally questionable. They grapple, as we all do, with the philosophical issues with an all-powerful, loving, knowing God in a world with so much suffering and pain. And so there's something to be said there where people would just resist the notion of God. I wouldn't want to believe in such a being. And so there can be an emotional reason where atheists have a personal distaste of God, and out of that personal distaste of God will employ their intellect to kind of avoid or find any loophole around entertaining the possibility of God's existence. Theists are also guilty of this. It's not just the atheists who do this. Christians, I've known Christians who might believe in God for the wrong reasons, not out of evidence, but because, and while this is understandable, it's not necessarily excusable, because of desire for an afterlife where they don't want an end to their love relationships, or because they want to avoid the amoral, nihilistic implications of a godless world. And so that would seem unbearable and unthinkable. And so it's better and easier to think of God. Atheists might decide they don't want to believe in God because, it's easier to go about life knowing there's not any ultimate accountability, which you're subject to. And that really you can do what you want without that hanging on your conscience. It's easier to go through life like that. And so you could say the atheist is someone who isn't necessarily denying the existence of God, but they remain unconvinced and or resistant to the notion of God. And so that's psychology for you. That's a psychological perspective. But in philosophy, things are a bit different. And this is where I think the misunderstanding comes along. So from a philosophical perspective, which deals more with your abstract debates and logical reasoning, atheism is more appropriately understood as someone who denies the existence of God or gods. We'll just say God, for example.
It's an active claim. Rather than they don't have a belief that there is a God, it's that they believe that there is no God.
Yeah, so they believe that I believe we live in a godless universe. So it's not enough to just suspend judgment, say I lack belief. That's not enough to be an atheist in a philosophical context. It's an explicit denial. You are making a claim, I believe we live in a godless universe. There is no ultimate creator. There is no transcendent mind. This is it. And so, and this has been popular, by the way. This is not something, many leading atheistic philosophers have wrote about atheism in this way. Most encyclopedias write about atheism in this way. And I'll quote it here. So the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy defines atheism as the view that there are no gods. A widely used sense denotes merely not believing in God and is consistent with agnosticism in a psychological sense. A stricter sense denotes a belief that there is no God, and this use has become the standard. And in that essay, we kind of reference a couple of atheistic philosophers who write about atheism in this way to show that has been the norm in philosophy. There's been some sort of detachment from that more recently, where people will adopt the psychological understanding of atheism in a philosophical context, which would be inappropriate. So they'll bring that into a philosophical debate or argument and say, well, I'm just lacking belief in a God in a philosophical debate, which wouldn't be right. I think this confusion has probably come from, so there's a philosopher named Anthony Flew who brought about this sort of spectrum of atheism where he talks about strong or positive atheism, or weak or negative atheism. So strong or positive atheism is someone who firmly believes that we live in a godless universe, there is no God or gods, whereas a weak or negative atheism is a lack of belief in God. It's more of your agnostic atheist, so to say, even though I think that's a contradiction in philosophy. But so you have those, so that kind of bringing in that spectrum has kind of confused, I think, the discussion about what atheism is when you're trying to have a logical philosophical debate. And you can see this. Does that make sense? Is that clear? We can give an analogy to kind of expand on that.
An analogy would be helpful, yeah.
So let's say you tell me there's extraterrestrial life out there, there's an alien out there, and you give me your reasons, you give me the evidence you think convinced you that there's an extraterrestrial life out there. And so I might look at that and say, based on the evidence you show me and based on other evidence I know about, I actually think you're wrong. There is no extraterrestrial life out there. I'm being a positive atheist, so to say, about it. Whereas if I say, okay, I've seen the evidence you had, but I'm still not quite convinced, it's not going to quite do it, and it's not enough for me. There might be extraterrestrial life out there, but I'm just not sure. So I'm being a psychological atheist about the situation. And so you get this sort of spectrum. I think it's fair to say that does represent how a lot of atheists feel. In the atheistic community, you have the adamant there is no God, and you have those who sit more on the agnostic side of things. Now, I don't think it's appropriate to use that psychological understanding in a philosophical context, in how we debate, in how we think about the existence of God. And I'll give some reasons why, but I'm going to read it out straight from what we wrote some time ago. When it comes to that spectrum, Anthony Flew's sort of broader idea of it. On the one hand, atheism is understood as a psychological state, essentially the absence of belief in God or gods. On the other hand, atheism is constructed as a propositional state, outrightly denying the existence of such divine entities. And so the issue kind of arises where if we define atheism as a psychological state, then no proposition, including strong atheism, can be considered a form of atheism, given that a proposition is in a psychological state, which kind of just leaves that out in the nowhere. Also, a sort of another reason is that the psychological definition, despite its simplicity, it requires refining to avoid labeling things such as infants, pets, or innate or just non-living objects like rocks as atheists, because due to their capacity to understand or believe in God. A newborn baby, you could say, lacks belief in God, but it wouldn't be appropriate to call a newborn baby an atheist.
Yeah,
just because they can't grapple with these concepts.
I had an angry atheist once rant at me about how we all had to be indoctrinated to believe in God. When I was born, I didn't believe in God, so it's all indoctrination. And I thought, well, I also didn't believe in quasars. I didn't believe in infrared light. It's a pretty weak argument that these things don't exist because we had to be indoctrinated. But apart from that, it's a sneaky way to grow your number of followers, to define it as something that lacks belief, because yes, every atom is an atheist by that definition.
And also it's like, even in the religious circles, you can have the devout religious and not always 100% confidence in God's existence. They're going for a sort of spiritual journey, so they might have moments of doubt. And so to say that that person is an atheist because they lack belief sometimes wouldn't be appropriate. Also, what happens if you have someone who's sort of, they're not fully confident whether God exists, but they lean towards the likelihood that the existence of God is more probable? Well, you wouldn't call them an atheist, but you would in that psychological sense. So it just would seem inappropriate to use it in a lot of instances. So another reason, which I think would be why it's more appropriate to use the philosophical understanding in a philosophical context, is that atheism has a symmetry with theism. So defining atheism as a psychological state creates a mismatch, since theism isn't defined that way. Most isms is understood as a sort of proposition or statement that can be argued or evaluated for truth or falsehood. And so psychological states can't be objectively true or false, nor can they form a conclusion of philosophical arguments. And so theism is defined as the belief that God exists, but this belief references what's believed, not the mental state of believing. So if theism is the proposition that God exists, and a theist is someone who believes this proposition, then it's logical to define atheism and an atheist in a similar manner. And so this means we should consider atheism as a proposition or statement that can be argued, and an atheist is someone who believes this statement. And so since it is natural to define atheism in terms of theism, it's more intuitive, at least, to say that the A in atheism is more a negation, rather than an absence without. And so, in other words, atheism becomes the denial, the contradiction of theism, rather than its absence, unless we have other reasons to think otherwise. So the fact that we define theism and atheism, that atheism is defined from theism, it would be wrong to have a philosophical one and then use this as a psychological state. It'd be more appropriate to define them on the same wavelength. And there's also, and I won't get into too many other things, there's also what you call the hallmarks of belief. So a belief becomes an identity marker, and atheism has become an identity marker for a lot of atheists. It can create action. A lot of atheists are driven by their passion. They'll meet up on atheistic forums. They'll go to parties of atheism. I mean, politically, it drives more than what you just see as a non-belief. It has fruit to it. It might impact philosophically your moral compass. Where do you think morals come from? Well, now there's a new grounding, and what does this say about my destiny and my origin? And so how does this impact the way I go about my life? It does influence those things, and so it has the fruits of what you might say is a belief. You might turn to humanism as a form of philosophical grounding for your morality, and so there's a big impact on your lifestyle. So it carries the fruit or the hallmarks of a belief, and we can go a lot more into that. Although there's more people can read on there on that essay. It maybe you ask questions about the meaning of life. Is the meaning of life illusionary? Is it something which we've just created? What's it based on? Can I create it myself? Would that even be consistent? And so there's so much coming from that, which would characterize as sort of, it's a bigger existential belief statement question than just a mere psychological state. And so the question then, okay, why is that important? Okay, so if we use this philosophical definition of atheism, there is no God. We live in a godless worldview. If that's the most appropriate use in a philosophical, in a logical debate, then that now pushes the burden of proof on both the Christian theist, I'm just going to say that because that's what I am, and the atheist. It's not like you can say there and go, pick out the flaws in Christian theism and put all the questions on me without having the responsibility to answer those same questions when I put it back in another way to yourself. So you also have to defend the view that living in a godless universe is reasonable, that it makes sense, that there's evidence to prove that's more likely.
Right. So the only person who doesn't have a burden of proof, that they have to justify what they, the angle they're coming from is the people who say they're not coming from an angle, people who say they don't know, they're agnostic, or they don't care, or something.
And agnostic can mean that. It can mean I don't know, or it can mean I just don't care, I'm not interested. Mm-hmm. I think a sort of where you get the pushback on this is someone would say, well, what about if I don't believe in, I mean, there's numerous things I don't believe in, which I don't feel like I have to give reasons for. I don't believe there's that flying spaghetti monster going around Jupiter. Does that now mean I have to give reasons as to why I don't think that's reasonable?
But the thing is, I don't believe there is not a flying spaghetti monster. I believe it is incredibly improbable. But I haven't looked at every space around Jupiter and determined that there is not. I just think it's very, very unlikely. So I mean, maybe I'm a bit like Dawkins, because someone asked Dawkins, like in a certainty scale, 0 to 10 of his atheism, 10 being he is absolutely no shadow of a doubt sure that there is no God. He said he's a 9.9 on a good day.
Yeah.
And so maybe he should be called a very doubting agnostic, but he calls himself an atheist because it has the rhetorical power to it.
Yes.
Which actually, okay, there's a bit more honesty in that. But if it wasn't for the fact that he always goes around calling himself an atheist, it's like he's a very doubting agnostic. That's probably a bit more accurate. I guess in a similar sense, when you mentioned earlier someone who would call themselves a theist or a Christian or a Hindu or whatever, but they have moments of doubt, it is still appropriate to say you're in a certain category as a believer, even though you have moments of doubt. And so maybe someone who has moments when they think, but however, on the other hand, there's this argument that, it probably doesn't carry strength, but, there's this kind of wrestling and they're not 100%. And so we'll all be on that scale somewhere, but it does still make sense to have these a grouping together of a category on in the middle, in either end, with different perspectives according to our proclivities. But when we make a claim, when we form an identity around that, then we kind of need to justify it, especially in a debate context.
Yeah. It's also important to it's important to differentiate between things you passively don't believe in and things you actively don't believe in. So, there's numerous things I passively don't believe in, which don't really have impact on mine or anyone else's life, which I don't feel like I have to give lots of reasons for, because it's probably not worth the time and effort. There's things I actively disagree with or actively agree with, which I do have to give reasons for, because it does have an impact. It does carry weight. There's lots of things which come from that. It's important to differentiate, I think, between those two categories. But as we go there, so being a philosophical atheist, it's not enough just to point out the supposed flaws in the alternative worldview and put the questions there, and then when they can't answer a question, go, that's right, I've won, and think you're clever. That would just be an immature way to deal with an argument. You've also got the burden of proof to show, and this is why I think it's more helpful to pose questions as, okay, which makes more sense of the world, theism or atheism? Which is more reasonable? Which aligns more closely with the scientific evidence? It's not to say that any of them are going to be 100% or going to have all the answers, or you're going to have all the answers within that worldview. But which makes the most sense? And at the moment, we see a lot of questions pushed to the Christians until they can't answer a question or not sure and say, gotcha. But it's like, well, actually, it still seems to me more reasonable than atheism. There's lots of things about God I'm clueless about. I don't understand philosophically about Christianity, which I don't get. But when I compare it to atheism, it's far more reasonable as far as I'm concerned. And let me just I'll read out this bit which we wrote before. The concept of a world without God logically implies a naturalistic worldview, and thus atheists carry the intellectual duty of offering materialistic explanations for things such as the origin of the universe, its fine-tuning, the laws of nature, logic, mathematics, consciousness, and the inception of life, all within the purview of naturalism. They are called upon to craft in convincing arguments demonstrating how such a complex and intricately ordered world could possibly arise from processes that are void of any conscious direction or deliberation, underpinned by coincidence. You can't really avoid that final bit. And so the notion that our sophisticated, orderly universe and everything it including within it might just be a product of happen chance calls for a plausible explanation, one which is sort of underpinned by solid reason and empirical evidence. And that's what I think is where it falls short, is that a lot of people think, well, I'm not convinced of Christianity, therefore I'm going to default to atheism, without realizing when actually you're not avoiding the questions. You just got a whole different set of questions put onto you. everyone believes in something. You're not enough to say I believe in nothing and think you're clever. Everyone has a worldview. Everyone has a lens by which they look at the world. And you have got to provide a justification for that. You have got to show how that's rational and reasonable and intuitive. So you've got to make sense of love, the value of life, the existence of real evil from an atheist perspective. Does the materialistic ontology inherent in atheism allow for an objective valuation of life? Can we make universally constrained ethical statements, or do these concepts become a matter of subjective preference without any obligation? Does atheism, it doesn't absolve you from explaining, it just sets a different set of questions. And that's why I have the problem, is that when I look at atheism, I don't think it's rational, I don't think it's reasonable, I don't think it's intuitive, I don't think it makes sense of science and history, and some of the philosophical questions we have about the world. And so because of that, doesn't mean I have all the answers in Christian theism, but I think it's far more reasonable in Christian theism than I do think it is in atheism. And that's how I think we should frame our debates. Which makes the most sense of the world? Not which has all the answers. Which makes the most sense of the world? And to also pick your debates. So be interested to think what you have on this, but I think you got to be, it's not always worth engaging with a debate or a discussion. You got people who, I'm an atheist, who are able to steel man your arguments, and they're able to think about the opposing views, and you can have back and forth, and you're both thinking respectively. And there's other atheists who just return to insult and mockery. And it's not worth engaging in those sort of debates. And they'll put all the questions on you. And as soon as you return a question, you'll get banned from the Reddit page, or you'll just get ignored, or you'll get mocked and laughed at. And so it's worth picking your discussions wisely as to where it's going to be fruitful and where you're just going to be wasting time. Yeah,
we've got to start with this perspective that truth is the valuable thing that we're trying to get to.
Yes.
You believe something different to me. You have a different conception of what the truth is. But if we can both start by agreeing that it is truth that we're both working on through debate, through getting toward that, then we can. It was Chesterton, I think, he said that too many good arguments have been spoiled by a quarrel. And I think if we have this perspective that you and I, although we think opposite things, we're both aiming for the same thing. We're aiming for truth.
Yes.
And we're going to make the ideas in our head fight merely so that we can kind of test them and kind of work out which idea is going to stand, so that we can both go away a bit more intelligent. Then there can be a good faith debate and discussion. But sometimes the main priority is to prove that I'm right and you're wrong, and not just atheists, just theists, anyone that can have this approach to things. But yeah, it's interesting you said that, because I think a lot of Christian theists will say that the atheists can be really difficult to argue with, and I think the atheists will say that a lot of the Christians can be difficult to argue with. So we're both obviously missing something there. I think a key is to be curious. If we can be curious about the other person, their perspective, tell me your story. Like, why do you think that?
Yes.
We start with that for the first half of any debate and discussion. I mean, it's the Socratic method. If you know what you're doing, you can make a blooming good argument just by asking questions. You can kind of draw out and pick holes in things. And it's a much more gentle way, because you kind of allow the person to lead you there. But also it means that you're not just preaching at someone and shouting at them, but you really are making sure you understand their perspective first.
And to repeat back to someone what they've said to show that you've understood it, because then they can point you out if you haven't quite understood it. And you'd be surprised how easily your emotions get in the way of you misunderstanding someone's argument sometimes. So to repeat back to someone, okay, so you're arguing this, have I understood it right? Is this what you're saying? But you're right, where both can listen to each other. What I think the problem is how I've experienced it is that it's one-sided at the moment. All the pressure and all the kind of fire's gone to the Christians and the theists, and the default supposedly of atheism is just sat there getting a green light. And actually there's a set of questions which you have to answer as well. And you've got to think about that. And so hopefully that will encourage us to be a bit more open, I think. a bit more thoughtful.
Right. So atheism isn't simply a default that you can go back to after finding flaws and problems in theistic perspective, philosophy, worldview. But atheists also have explaining to do to justify their truth claims. And that means that atheism doesn't necessarily provide more arguments for the world we see around us. In fact, it by definition provides fewer, because theism says that there are many different ways that processes and phenomena can be explained in the world. One of those, or an ultimate explanation, could be God. And atheism can say all the same claims about things that can be explained in the world by other things, but it just excludes one thing that the theist also includes. So it's just limiting your plethora of possible explanations for phenomenon in the world. So actually that means it has a harder time, because it's limiting the causal resource for phenomena in the world. And it has a job to do in debates, in standing up for itself. It's not justified anymore for atheists to simply say, well, I don't believe in a God, you're the one making the claim, so therefore you have to do all the philosophical legwork, and I can just sit here and poke holes in what you're saying. We both have to work to make a case for the perspective we have.